Hi there. Today we're going to begin our discussion of Japan and the massive changes it underwent as it was introduced to the modern world. When we last left Japan during the Edo period, they had a very strict laws of seclusion, and they were promoting this idea of SinoJapanese, fear the emperor, expel the barbarians, and this idea of sakoku, this national seclusion. We were not going to let anyone in, and we're going to let anyone out. And we know there was a small trickle of foreigners who were arriving in Nagasaki. The Dutch mainly had a port there. But really, Japan was a kind of a backwater without any real industrialization and without any real awareness of what was actually happening in the outside world. This all comes to a rather sudden change with the arrival of Commodore Perry in 1853, where he arrives with this fleet of steam-powered gunboats, which are just leagues ahead of any kind of military the Japanese shogun have. And Perry at first was sort of gracious and encouraging, but then when he was rebuffed by the samurai, he came back very belligerently, claiming that he had a right and was going to demand that they open their ports to trade, or he would essentially blow them open. So Japan, without any ability to fight back or speak up for itself, was forced into a very inadvantageous trade agreements with the Americans, and then quickly followed the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians. Everyone came pounding at their door. So the Treaty of Kanagawa on March 31st, 1854, inserted a most favored nation clause, which means that if Japan conceded any new agreement to any other country, then the U.S. would automatically get that same privilege as well. So this was a sort of failing of the shogunate. There was a kind of collapse of the social order. There was a civil war, and the samurai were essentially disbanded, and it became outlawed to carry a samurai sword. Here we see image from biographies of modern men, the suicide of a samurai warrior who was fighting at the last battle of the samurai. We see the sword broken. We see he's turned a musket on himself in this sort of horrific and bloody way. This very graphic and grueling image was by a very celebrated artist, Taisho Yoshida, who had a very extraordinary reputation for doing grueling, grisly, graphic, and much more realistic images, but also ones that seem to harken back to the traditional past. And I think that's what makes Taisho Yoshida so interesting, is that once he is very modern and very forward-looking, at the same time sort of deeply rooted in the traditional image making of the woodblock print tradition. So we can see this image here. It's very closely related to the Kamakura guardians of Buddhism, the Neo, and you can see how the sort of musculature of this samurai is kind of rippling with the same kind of stylized intensity as these guardians figures were. But also notice that the cartouche, the red label on the document, is actually made in a very sort of ornate in a sort of Western style. It's as if we're seeing this now through Western eyes. And he's introducing these Western elements even as he sort of harkens back to other images and ideas from the traditional past. Here again, an image by Taisho Yoshida, The Arrival of the Black Ships. In this, we see all these boats sort of going out to visit these massive, dominating black ships, and they're sort of imposing right on the horizon. And there's this wonderful realism. We see the colors of the people, and we see them sort of moving toward this. But also notice the colors and the ornamentation. It's very clearly a kind of Western decoration, Western ornamentation in his frames. The purples and the greens and the yellows, these are all these new anodyne dyes that were coming in, and as a part of this sort of new modern look that emerges in what would be called the Meiji Era, this new era of emergent modernism. Here's another traditional image by Taisho Yoshida. This is based on the No play, Matsukaze, we talked briefly about in the No Theater. And here he's created this very realistic image of this elite prince on the shoreline, sort of flirting with these local ladies, who then become the two ghosts of the No play. So in a sense, he's always celebrating the traditional past. At the same time, he's introducing these sort of modern look and a modern feel. This is a late work. He did a whole series of prints based on traditional ghosts, a very popular theme in Woodblock Prince. But in this, he's celebrating the Crane Maiden, a dance performance from Kabuki. The Crane Maiden we see here, this spectacular robe and these very realistic birds. But notice the thing that's really extraordinary about this image is this sort of tattered edge, this sort of worn frame that this image is emerging out of. It seems so fresh and vibrant and intensely beautiful. At the same time, it's tattered and fading and decaying. And during this time, the traditional arts and cultures are suffering tremendously. Kabuki actors and performers, no performers, are all now out of work and poor. Printmakers, such as it would produce this print, the woodblock printmakers are going out of business. Lithography has emerged. At the time, in 1888, there were over 100 publishers in Tokyo who used the new technology of lithography, not woodblock prints. And so there's this massive change happening in Japan, and Taisho Yoshida is sort of clinging on to the traditional past, but also sort of clearly aware of its fading and disappearing nature. The real beauty of this print is only realized when you can actually see it in person, which I had the great pleasure to do not too long ago at the Tarbell Arts Center when they had an exhibition of Taisho Yoshida's. Here, if you looked up closely, what looked simply as a white robe is actually embossed with this just beautiful sort of quilted pattern across the kimono of the Crane Maiden. This is karazuri embossing that is done by wetting the print and then pressing in a kind of design on the paper, but not applying any ink to it to create this sort of rich texture. What's so beautiful about this is this, of course, is something that can only be done in a woodblock print process. And it sort of speaks to the beauty and the character of an actual printed object in this traditional way, not something that could be done in a lithograph or any other reproduction like a photograph. There was a great fascination for all things Western, foreign. The Japanese government sent a delegation of scholars around the world to study governments, to learn from how different systems of government worked, to try and incorporate and learn. They wrote a report that was really instrumental in how they were going to proceed. And it's very interesting. They were very impressed with Germany, and they took a great deal of lessons from the German system of government. And so with these changes, we see also a Woodblock Prince sort of celebrating the idea of foreign capitals. This picture here is supposedly Washington, D.C., but anyone who's anywhere familiar with the architecture of Washington, D.C. will quickly note that this skyline looks nothing at all like Washington, D.C. In fact, the design of the buildings was taken from an image of the Illustrated London News, which was a picture of New Delhi. Another very interesting picture about this sort of new modern world is this picture here showing foreigners in Yokohama enjoying a Kabuki play. What's so interesting about this picture is we see the foreigners in the front row. They're sitting on their Western chairs, not on the floor. We see the Western wagon rolling through here. But notice on the stage, we see the performers. But beside the performers are a series of figures in black. Now, these figures, their job is to be like stage lighting. You can see they have these long poles. And at the end of the pole, there's a little plate with a candle on it. And the way they would perform, these figures in black would literally hold these candles up to the faces of the actor to light them as they were acting. Now, these stage hands have always been in Kabuki, but you've never seen them up until this point because they were not supposed to be seen. They're not a part of the performance. Unless, of course, you're a foreigner where you're like mystified by what are these black-robed people doing on the stage with candles and plates in them. This sort of stylization and affectation of Kabuki became more apparent. So what I find really interesting about this image is the way that it shows us the way the foreigners see Kabuki, this kind of antiquated, stylized, abstract theater. And Kabuki was really struggling at this time because they had always been at the vanguard. They had always been at the latest fashion and represented, what people were interested in, what was happening in the city today. But with these changes in society so quick and so sudden, they didn't know what to do. There were a number of experiments. One was called the cropped hair Kabuki, where they would dress and put on clothes in Western style, sit in chairs, and put on a kind of Western performance. This was the advertisement to one such performance, The Strange Tale of Castaways, a Western Kabuki, that was performed in 1879. This Zangiri Mono tradition was a catastrophic failure. The audience laughed. They thought it looked ridiculous and stupid, and it was just an embarrassment. And so this was one of the challenges, that Kabuki could not find a way forward. It could no longer represent the here and the now. And so from this time forward, Kabuki really becomes a kind of theater of the Edo period, a kind of nostalgic look back to the way things were at that time. And it no longer really represents the times it's in. Fashions, Western tastes, smoking cigarettes, all of these things become the part of the new sort of obsession with these Yokohama prints, where we can start to look at the customs and manners of peoples of other parts of the world. It felt like Japan had gotten it wrong. They were so backward because they were attached to these outdated modes that they hadn't modernized, they hadn't industrialized. So there's sort of a whole-scale abandoning of traditional ways and really a sort of desperate attempt to try and learn from foreigners. We can see the stories of famous Western people, James Audubon, and how his ingenuity, his drive, his creativity led to his success. And so these kinds of Meiji Era stories, this also falls over into Japanese, who are very forward-thinking and modern, such as we see Kobayashi Koike, Fujiki Genchiro from the Instructive Models of Lofty Ambition, sort of promoting famous Japanese. This was one of the first Western journalists who in Japan, who was a Japanese, who reported on wars on the front. And so this way in which Japan tries to modernize and industrialize, it does this at an incredible transformation. The other side of this at the same time is a growing militarization of Japan. While there were forces that were trying to resist the militarization, they were also determined not to become victims, not to lose their faith and become captive to foreign powers, such as they saw in Thailand, in Burma, in Malaysia, and in Indonesia, and was happening also to China. They were losing control of their destiny. They were no longer autonomous governments, and they were completely under the control of foreign powers. So Japan was determined to reassert itself in this new board game, and it really felt that it needed to promote this new nationalism. The emperor had been restored to power in this constitutional democracy, and along with the sort of nationalism was this reassertion of the divinity of the emperor. We see there was a successful new modern stage plays which reenacted famous battles. The first Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895 brought up a bunch of new images, new ideas about military power and strength. The Japanese able to annex Korea and move into areas in China, and eventually would fight back and defeat the Russians. This growing success in military powers led to new images sort of celebrating the violence and the victories. This is our elite forces occupying the Pescatore Islands of Taiwan. And so we see in here this kind of beautiful, elegant image where the violence is only reflected in the waters. Japan's image abroad was highly celebrated in the West. There was a huge fascination in France especially, but also England and the United States, for all things Japanese. This becomes known as kind of Japanisme, the sort of way in which this art and design seems so fresh, so new, so vibrant, so vital. And the old neoclassical ways of making images and ways of representing things began to fall away against this new graphic, bold silhouettes, asymmetrical compositions, and this idea of printmaking that became really the Woodblock Prince became especially an important touchstone for European ideas about Japanese art. Here, Oscar Wilde, in his Decay of Lying, writes, "The whole of Japan is pure invention. There is no such country. There are no such people. The Japanese people are simply a mode of style, an exquisite fancy of art." And it's true that in this time, there was very little attempt to really understand Japanese ideas about art. It was so fresh and new, it felt that anybody could be an expert on Japanese art. People who had some knowledge could suddenly become the people who everyone was listening to. All you needed to do is have a reaction to it. It was so new and fresh. It sort of promoted this kind of amateurism. And the ideas that Japan was a country with a history and a tradition was immaterial. People were sort of fascinated by the colors, the shapes, the forms. And they disregarded this art as having a place in a country and a time in history like we consider in this class. There was a very interesting story of a theater troupe that arrived in San Francisco and 1900s and began performing Western-style theater. They had not had any success in Japan performing Western-style theater. So with just a wing and a prayer, they found themselves in the shores of the U.S., and suddenly they were a huge hit. This was a real live performance from Japan, and this Western-style performance featured a woman playing a female role, which of course didn't exist in Japan at this time. Kabuki's tradition had always been men playing women's roles. And so this woman, Sadayako Kawakami, she becomes an international star. They cross the U.S., sold out audiences, they go to Europe, they play to all the crowned heads of Europe, they're a massive success. They go back to Japan and they sort of promote themselves as this international phenomenon. And suddenly they are able to attract an audience in Japan. And Sadayako Kawakami is considered to be one of the first female performers on the Japanese stage, returning after centuries of being banned. So the obsession and fascination with all things Japanese, we can see it influenced in design, in the metro stops in Paris, all this sort of art nouveau, this sort of borrowing of this sort of flatness of the image, this very few shadow, curves and swirling lines we see in art nouveau, all sort of inspired by and influenced from the sort of Japanese interest in organic shapes and forms. This was, of course, greatly celebrated by Alphonse Maria Mucha, who becomes the star graphic designer of Paris at this time and hugely influential. He draws on the sort of Japanese influence and ideas and really celebrates this sort of elegant, delicate design work. Japan, in turn, in order to appeal to foreign countries, self-adopts this Art Nouveau style, as we see in the World Exhibition of 1911. This poster is very clearly drawn from the designs of Alphonse Mucha, and we can see the sort of parade of national flags at the bottom of the image. Well, all of these countries now, Japan with its flag with the red dot right there, is just one among many of nations. It didn't quite work out that well for them. In fact, Japan was repeatedly humiliated at trade negotiations from the United States and from Europe. And these grievances would eventually lead to the inevitable conflict that was World War II.